Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, disguised as burdens we never wanted to carry. Sometimes a man's lowest moment becomes the doorway to his greatest triumph. Marcus Sullivan stood in the shadow of the massive hangar doors, holding a rusted key that felt heavier than it should, staring at what everyone called his inheritance of junk. The locals had been laughing behind his back for weeks, whispering about the foolish city man who'd inherited nothing but headaches and debt from his eccentric uncle. What they didn't know was that this crumbling hangar held secrets that would soon turn their mockery into awe and transform a struggling father's desperate circumstances into something extraordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But first, he had to survive the humiliation of being the town's newest joke. What happens when a man who has lost everything discovers that sometimes our greatest blessings come wrapped in our deepest disappointments? The eviction notice had been tucked under Marcus Sullivan's apartment door like a coward's goodbye note, impersonal and final. 30 days to vacate the cramped two-bedroom unit that had been home to him and his 8-year-old daughter Emma for the past 3 years. The rent had gone up again, the third increase in 18 months, and his salary as a junior accountant at a struggling firm barely covered groceries, let alone housing in the city's inflated market. Marcus sat at their tiny kitchen table, the notice spread before him like evidence of his failures as a father. Emma was at school, unaware that their already precarious world was about to collapse entirely. She'd been through enough upheaval in her short life. Her mother had walked out when Emma was 4, leaving behind only a note about needing to find herself and a forwarding address that led to a dead end. Since then, Marcus had been both mother and father, working extra hours while trying to maintain the illusion of stability for a little girl who deserved so much more than his paycheck could provide. The apartment reflected their circumstances with painful clarity. Secondhand furniture arranged to hide the stains and scratches, a television that required percussive maintenance to maintain a clear picture, and Emma's bedroom decorated with artwork she'd created because they couldn't afford store-bought decorations. But it was theirs, and more importantly, it was consistent. Emma had her own space, her own routines, a sense of security that Marcus had fought desperately to preserve. Now that security was crumbling, and he had no idea how to rebuild it. His job at Fletcher & Associates was barely surviving the economic downturn. 3 colleagues had been laid off in the past month, and Marcus knew his position hung by the thinnest of threads. His boss, Richard Fletcher, had made it clear that the firm needed to cut costs wherever possible, and junior staff were expendable luxuries they could no longer afford. The morning routine proceeded with forced normalcy. Emma bounded into the kitchen, wearing her favorite purple dress and mismatched socks, her dark hair pulled into pigtails that never quite stayed even despite Marcus's best efforts. She'd inherited her mother's delicate features, but thankfully none of Sarah's restless dissatisfaction with domestic life. Emma found joy in small things, collected smooth stones from playground visits, and drew elaborate pictures of imaginary adventures that she shared with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed the world was fundamentally good. "Daddy, you look sad," she observed while eating her cereal, her 8-year-old intuition cutting straight through his attempts at cheerful parenting. Did something bad happen? Marcus forced a smile that felt like lifting weights. "Just grown-up stuff, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." When grown-ups say that, it usually means something really bad happened, but they think kids can't handle knowing about it, Emma replied with unsettling wisdom. "I'm tougher than you think, Daddy." The comment broke Marcus's heart because it was absolutely true. Emma had adapted to their circumstances with resilience that humbled him daily. She never complained about their small apartment, never asked for toys they couldn't afford, never questioned why other children had birthday parties at expensive venues, while hers consisted of homemade cake and dollar store decorations. She'd learned to be tough because circumstances had demanded it, and that knowledge filled Marcus with both pride and profound sadness. His phone buzzed against the table, displaying a number he didn't recognize with a distant area code. Marcus almost ignored it, assuming another debt collector or telemarketer, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman with a slight southern accent, professional but warm. "Is this Marcus Sullivan?" Yes, this is Marcus. My name is Dorothy Hensley. I'm calling from the law offices of Hensley and Associates in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I'm handling the estate of your late uncle, Walter Sullivan. Marcus frowned. He had vague memories of Uncle Walter from childhood visits, a eccentric man who'd lived alone on a farm outside some small town. His father's brother had been the family oddball, never married, always tinkering with old machinery, sending birthday cards with $5 bills until Marcus reached adulthood and the cards stopped coming. They'd lost touch completely over the years. I wasn't aware that Uncle Walter had passed away, Marcus said carefully. He died 6 weeks ago. Heart attack, very sudden. I've been trying to locate his next of kin. According to his will, you're his sole heir. The words didn't compute immediately. Marcus had never expected to inherit anything from anyone, certainly not from a relative he barely knew. I'm sorry, did you say sole heir? Yes, Mr. Sullivan. Your uncle left you his property, which includes a 40-acre farm and several outbuildings. There's also a rather substantial hangar that was his primary focus in recent years. Marcus felt a flutter of hope, mixed with confusion. Property meant assets, possibly enough to solve their immediate housing crisis. What's the property worth? Dorothy's pause lasted long enough to deflate his optimism. Well, that's somewhat complicated. The farmhouse is in poor condition, hasn't been properly maintained in decades. The outbuildings are mostly unusable, and the hangar, while structurally sound, contains what appears to be a collection of old aircraft parts and machinery that would be expensive to remove. Aircraft parts? Your uncle was apparently something of an aviation enthusiast. The hangar is filled with old airplane engines, propellers, that sort of thing. Most of it looks like junk, frankly, but it would cost thousands to have it hauled away. The property has been on the market before with no serious interest because of the cleanup costs involved. The flutter of hope died completely. Instead of a solution, Marcus had inherited a problem, a property nobody wanted because of the expense involved in making it usable. So what exactly am I inheriting? 40 acres of farmland that hasn't been cultivated in years, buildings that need extensive repair, and a hangar full of old airplane junk. There are also some debts against the property. Back taxes that would need to be settled. To be completely honest, Mr. Sullivan, this inheritance might cost you money, rather than provide any benefit. Marcus stared at the eviction notice, feeling the weight of impossible choices. He could decline the inheritance and continue struggling in the city until they were evicted, or accept it and move to rural Iowa with no job prospects and a property that might bankrupt him anyway. Neither option offered much hope. How long do I have to decide? The paperwork can be processed within a week if you choose to accept. You'd need to come to Cedar Falls to sign documents and take possession. But there's no rush. The property isn't going anywhere. After ending the call, Marcus sat in their quiet kitchen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Trying to process this unexpected development. Emma would be devastated to leave the city, her school, the few friends she'd managed to make despite their frequent moves. But staying meant homelessness within a month, and his job prospects weren't improving. At least in Iowa, they'd have a roof over their heads, even if it was a leaking roof in the middle of nowhere. That evening, over dinner consisting of pasta with generic sauce and frozen vegetables, Marcus tried to explain their situation in terms an 8-year-old could understand. Remember Uncle Walter, Daddy's uncle who used to send you birthday cards when you were little? Emma nodded, though her memories were clearly vague. Well, Uncle Walter passed away, and he left us his farm in Iowa. It's in a small town called Cedar Falls. Are we going to live there? Emma asked, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. We might need to. Our lease here is up soon, and it's getting very expensive to live in the city. Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to all major announcements. Will I have to change schools again? The question cut deep, because she'd already changed schools twice in 3 years due to their frequent moves in search of affordable housing. Each transition had been difficult, requiring her to make new friends, adapt to different teachers, prove herself academically in environments that didn't know her capabilities. Yes, sweetheart, you probably would. Will there be other kids to play with? I don't know yet. We'd have to see. Emma nodded slowly, processing information that would determine her immediate future. Is the farm pretty? I don't know that either. I haven't seen it since I was very young. Will we have animals? I don't think so. It's not that kind of farm anymore. Emma finished her dinner in contemplative silence, then announced her conclusion with the matter-of-fact acceptance that had become her signature response to upheaval. Well, if we have to move, we have to move. At least we'll be together. The simple statement summarized everything that mattered. As long as they were together, they could handle whatever challenges awaited them in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Marcus spent the night researching the town online, finding a community of fewer than 3,000 people surrounded by agricultural land, with one elementary school, a main street lined with locally owned businesses, and the kind of rural charm that looked appealing in photographs but might feel isolating in reality. He called Dorothy Hensley the following morning to accept the inheritance, setting in motion a chain of events that would uproot their lives and transplant them into circumstances he couldn't yet imagine. Within 2 weeks, their meager possessions were loaded into a rental truck, their city apartment abandoned to its next struggling tenant, their future tied to 40 acres of Iowa farmland, and a hangar full of what everyone assured him was worthless junk. The drive from Chicago to Cedar Falls took 5 hours through increasingly rural landscape. Emma pressed her face to the passenger window, watching cornfields and farmhouses replace the urban sprawl she'd known all her life. Her excitement was infectious, treating the journey like an adventure rather than exile, pointing out cows and horses with the enthusiasm of someone discovering entirely new species. Cedar Falls announced itself with a population sign that had been amended several times as numbers fluctuated with economic conditions. Main Street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, anchored by a bank on one end and a grain elevator on the other. The buildings looked solid but tired, reflecting a community that had seen better decades but maintained its dignity through careful maintenance and stubborn pride. The Sullivan farm lay 3 miles outside town, accessible via a gravel road that wound through cornfields and past scattered farmhouses. Marcus recognized the property from his childhood memories, though everything seemed smaller and more run down than he remembered. The farmhouse needed painting, several roof shingles were missing, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect, but the bones of the structure looked sound, and the setting was undeniably beautiful, surrounded by mature oak trees and rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. The hangar dominated the property like a metallic cathedral, its curved roof gleaming silver in the afternoon sun. It was larger than Marcus had expected, easily big enough to house several aircraft, with massive sliding doors that could accommodate planes with substantial wingspans. Uncle Walter had clearly invested significant resources in the structure, which appeared newer and better maintained than any other building on the property. Emma ran toward the hangar with characteristic fearlessness, her small figure dwarfed by its imposing presence. "Daddy, it's huge! What's inside?" Marcus fumbled with the keys Dorothy had given him, finding the one that opened the smaller access door beside the main hangar entrance. The door swung open with a metallic groan, releasing the smell of old oil, leather, and something else he couldn't identify, something that spoke of age and careful preservation. What they found inside defied every expectation Dorothy Hensley had established during their phone conversations. The hangar wasn't filled with junk or spare parts scattered randomly by an eccentric collector. Instead, it housed a carefully organized collection of vintage aircraft, each one positioned with museum-quality precision and obviously maintained with obsessive attention to detail. A bright yellow biplane dominated the center of the space. Its fabric-covered wings stretched taut and painted with military insignia from an era Marcus could only guess at. Behind it sat a sleek fighter plane with a shark's mouth painted on its nose, the kind he'd seen in old war movies but never expected to encounter in person. Along the walls, arranged like mechanical sculptures, were aircraft engines gleaming with fresh oil, propellers that looked ready for immediate installation, and equipment that suggested serious aviation expertise rather than casual hobbyist collection. Emma walked between the aircraft with wide-eyed wonder, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Daddy, are these real airplanes?" Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what he was seeing. These weren't junk parts or derelict machinery. These were restored vintage aircraft that belonged in museums or private collections worth serious money. His eccentric uncle hadn't been accumulating trash. He'd been curating aviation history with the dedication of someone who understood exactly what he possessed. A workbench along the far wall held logbooks, maintenance records, and documentation that suggested each aircraft had been restored to flying condition. Certificates from aviation authorities, insurance policies, registration documents, all meticulously filed and apparently current. Uncle Walter hadn't just been collecting old planes. He'd been maintaining a private fleet of historically significant aircraft. The implications hit Marcus like physical force. If these planes were authentic, if they'd been properly restored and maintained, they represented assets worth potentially millions of dollars. The junk that Dorothy Hensley had dismissed so casually might be the solution to every financial problem he'd ever faced, hidden in plain sight inside a hangar that everyone assumed contained worthless machinery. But even as hope began to build, practical concerns crowded his thoughts. He knew nothing about vintage aircraft, had no idea how to verify their authenticity or determine their value. For all he knew, they could be elaborate reproductions worth no more than the materials used to build them. The documentation might be forgeries. The restorations might be superficial. His uncle's obsession might have been based on delusions rather than genuine expertise. Emma had climbed onto the wing of the yellow biplane, running her small hands along its fabric surface with reverent curiosity. "Can they still fly, Daddy?" "I don't know, sweetheart. We'll have to find out." As afternoon faded toward evening, Marcus walked through the hangar, taking inventory of what he'd inherited. 7 complete aircraft, ranging from what appeared to be World War I-era biplanes to more modern fighters from the 1940s and 1950s. Spare engines, propellers, and parts organized with military precision. Tools that looked professional rather than hobbyist. Documentation that suggested legal ownership and proper maintenance. If even half of what he was seeing was authentic and valuable, his financial problems weren't just solved, but transformed into opportunities he'd never dared imagine. Emma could attend any school she wanted, live in any neighborhood they chose, pursue interests and activities that had been financially impossible just hours earlier. The inheritance that everyone had dismissed as a burden might actually be the greatest gift anyone had ever received. But first, he needed to verify what they'd actually found, and that would require expertise he didn't possess. The nearest major city was Des Moines, over an hour's drive, where aviation experts might be able to authenticate his uncle's collection and provide realistic valuations. Until then, he could only speculate about the treasure that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look beyond surface appearances and recognize its true worth. As they locked the hangar and walked toward the farmhouse that would be their new home, Emma slipped her small hand into his and squeezed gently. "I like it here, Daddy. It feels like the kind of place where good things happen." Marcus squeezed back, hoping his daughter's optimism would prove prophetic. They'd left the city as refugees from circumstances beyond their control, arriving in rural Iowa with nothing but hope and determination. Now they might be sitting on a fortune that could change not just their lives, but their entire understanding of what was possible when fate decided to disguise blessings as burdens. The evening sky stretched endlessly above the Iowa farmland, painted in shades of orange and gold that neither of them had ever seen from their apartment window. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever discoveries awaited them in the investigation of Uncle Walter's mysterious legacy, they would face them together in a place where vintage aircraft waited patiently in the shadows, ready to transform a struggling father's darkest moment into the brightest chapter of their lives. The farmhouse that night felt like camping in someone else's abandoned dream. Emma explored each room with the systematic thoroughness of an 8-year-old detective, cataloging discoveries that ranged from mundane to mysterious. Uncle Walter had lived simply but comfortably, his furniture functional rather than stylish, his personal effects suggesting a man who valued substance over appearance. In what had obviously been his office, Marcus found files that made his accounting background suddenly relevant to their situation. Uncle Walter had maintained detailed financial records, insurance policies, and correspondence with aviation museums, collectors, and restoration specialists. The paperwork painted a picture of someone deeply involved in the vintage aircraft community, someone whose expertise was recognized and respected by institutions that dealt in historically significant planes. A letter from the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, dated just 6 months earlier, expressed interest in acquiring, quote, the P-51 Mustang for their collection, mentioning a preliminary valuation that made Marcus's hands shake as he read. The figure discussed casually in the correspondence exceeded his annual salary by a factor of 10, and that was for just one aircraft among the 7 they'd discovered in the hangar. Emma had claimed the bedroom that overlooked the hangar, drawn by the view of their mysterious inheritance and the possibility of watching for activity around the massive structure. She'd arranged her few possessions with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making new spaces feel like home, her stuffed animals positioned to guard the window while she slept. "Daddy," she called from her new room as Marcus tucked her into bed. "Do you think Uncle Walter left us the airplanes because he knew we needed help?" The question struck him as profoundly insightful. Uncle Walter had no reason to know about their financial struggles, their housing insecurity, or Marcus's desperate job situation. But the timing of his death, the inheritance, their arrival at this exact moment when they most needed a miracle, it felt orchestrated by forces beyond coincidence. "Maybe he did, sweetheart. Sometimes people help us in ways we don't expect. I think he was probably lonely out here by himself with just the airplanes for company. Now the airplanes will have us to keep them company instead." Emma's ability to find emotional meaning in their circumstances never failed to amaze Marcus. She'd transformed their inheritance from a financial transaction into a story about loneliness and companionship, about Uncle Walter's aircraft finding new caretakers who would appreciate their significance. Sleep came fitfully for Marcus, his mind racing between possibilities and practical concerns. If the aircraft were as valuable as Uncle Walter's documentation suggested, he'd need expert authentication, proper insurance, secure storage, and legal advice about managing assets he'd never imagined owning. If they weren't valuable, he'd need to find work quickly in a rural community with limited opportunities, making their move a costly mistake that deepened their financial crisis. The next morning brought visitors who would help resolve at least some of his uncertainty. A pickup truck pulled into their gravel driveway just after breakfast, followed by a second vehicle that looked like it had been maintained with the same obsessive care Uncle Walter had applied to his aircraft collection. 2 men emerged from the vehicles, both wearing the kind of work clothes that suggested serious mechanical expertise. The older man introduced himself as Frank Patterson, owner of Patterson Aviation Services at the Cedar Falls Municipal Airport. His companion was Jim Bradley, introduced as the best aircraft mechanic in 3 counties and probably the only person who knew Walter better than Walter knew himself. "We heard Walter's nephew had arrived," Frank explained, shaking Marcus's hand with a grip that spoke of decades handling heavy machinery. "Figured you might have questions about what you inherited." "We were friends of your uncle's," Jim added, his voice carrying genuine affection and loss. "Helped him with some of the restoration work over the years. Those birds in the hangar were his pride and joy." Marcus felt relief wash over him. These men knew Uncle Walter personally, understood his collection, and could provide the expert perspective he desperately needed. "To be honest, I'm completely overwhelmed. I know nothing about vintage aircraft, and I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with." "Mind if we take a look?" Frank asked, gesturing toward the hangar. "Been wondering how the collection's holding up since Walter passed." As they walked toward the massive structure, Jim shared stories about Uncle Walter that painted a picture of a man who dedicated his later years to preserving aviation history. He'd been a mechanic in the Air Force during the Korean War, developing skills and knowledge that served him well during decades of restoration work. Each aircraft in his collection had been carefully researched, authentically restored, and maintained to flying condition with attention to detail that impressed professional collectors. "Walter didn't just collect old planes," Jim explained as Marcus unlocked the hangar doors. "He rescued them from scrapyards, barns, and museums that couldn't afford proper maintenance. Brought them back to life exactly as they would have been when they first rolled off production lines." The morning sunlight streaming through the open doors illuminated the collection in ways that artificial lighting couldn't match. Each aircraft seemed to glow with inner life, their polished surfaces reflecting decades of careful attention and obvious affection. Frank and Jim moved between the planes with the reverence of people entering a cathedral, their expertise evident in how they examined specific details and discussed technical aspects that meant nothing to Marcus, but everything to serious collectors. "This P-51 Mustang is absolutely pristine," Frank announced, running his hands along the fighter's sleek fuselage. "Walter spent 3 years getting the engine timing perfect, another 2 years on the paint scheme. It's not just restored. It's better than factory new. That Stearman over there," Jim pointed to the yellow biplane Emma had climbed on the previous day, "flew mail routes in the 1930s before it was converted to a crop duster." Walter tracked down the original documentation, found parts from 3 different wrecked aircraft, and rebuilt it exactly as it would have appeared in 1934. As the tour continued, Marcus began to understand that his inheritance wasn't just valuable. It was historically significant. Each aircraft represented a piece of aviation history that might otherwise have been lost to time, neglect, or the simple economics of maintaining complex machinery that few people understood or appreciated. "What do you think the collection is worth?" Marcus asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Frank and Jim exchanged glances that suggested they'd been anticipating the question and had already discussed their assessment privately. "Conservatively," Frank said carefully, "assuming proper authentication and documentation, you're looking at $8 to $10 million. If you found the right buyers, collectors who appreciated the quality of Walter's work, probably closer to $15 million. The figure hit Marcus like electricity, too large to process immediately. Emma had wandered over to listen to their conversation, and she looked up at him with eyes that had grown very wide. "Is that a lot of money, Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart," Marcus managed. "That's a lot of money." Jim continued with practical advice that Marcus struggled to absorb through his shock. "Course, liquidating a collection like this isn't simple. You'd want professional appraisals, insurance documentation, probably consignment through specialized auction houses that deal with warbirds. Could take months or even years to get full value, depending on market conditions. But if you needed quick cash," Frank added, "there are collectors who'd pay premium prices for immediate acquisition." Walter had offers on individual pieces that he turned down because he couldn't bear to break up the collection. The morning had transformed Marcus's understanding of their situation so completely that he felt dizzy with possibility. They weren't just financially secure. They were wealthy beyond anything he'd ever imagined. Emma would never have to worry about changing schools due to housing costs, never have to go without necessities or reasonable wants, never have to see her father stressed about money during conversations he thought she wasn't overhearing. But underneath the euphoria, practical concerns demanded attention. Wealth of this magnitude required management expertise he didn't possess, legal protections he didn't understand, and decisions that would affect not just their immediate circumstances, but Emma's entire future. "There's something else you should know," Jim said as their impromptu appraisal session concluded. "Walter always said this collection should stay together, that breaking it up would be like tearing pages out of a history book. He turned down individual sales because he believed the aircraft told a collective story about American aviation that was more valuable than the sum of their parts." The comment added emotional complexity to decisions Marcus was already struggling to process. Uncle Walter hadn't just left him financial assets, he'd entrusted him with preserving aviation history for future generations. The responsibility felt enormous, especially for someone who'd been worried about paying rent just weeks earlier. As Frank and Jim prepared to leave, they offered ongoing assistance with whatever decisions Marcus made about the collection. Both men had extensive contacts in the aviation community, relationships that could prove invaluable whether he decided to sell, loan, or maintain the aircraft himself. "One more thing," Frank said, pausing beside his pickup truck. "Walter left detailed maintenance schedules for each aircraft. If you decide to keep the collection, even temporarily, those birds need regular attention to stay in flying condition. Jim and I would be happy to help with that, out of respect for Walter's memory if nothing else." After their visitors departed, Marcus and Emma returned to the hangar for another walk through their inheritance. The space felt different now, charged with significance and possibility that transformed even casual observation into something approaching reverence. These weren't just old airplanes. They were carefully preserved pieces of American history, artifacts that connected past achievements to present opportunities in ways that transcended mere financial value. Emma had gravitated toward the yellow Stearman again, apparently having claimed it as her favorite among the collection. "Daddy, could we learn to fly these airplanes?" The question hadn't occurred to Marcus, but it highlighted another dimension of their inheritance. Uncle Walter hadn't just collected static displays, he'd maintained fully functional aircraft that were designed to take to the sky. The possibility of actually flying these historical machines added adventure to their already transformative circumstances. "Maybe we could, sweetheart. We'd have to learn how first." "Could we take flying lessons?" "I think we could afford flying lessons now." The afternoon brought phone calls that would shape their immediate future. Marcus contacted Dorothy Hensley to update her about what they'd discovered in the hangar, listening to her stunned silence as he described the authentication provided by Frank and Jim. Her dismissal of Uncle Walter's collection as worthless junk had been based on assumptions rather than expertise, a mistake that could have cost Marcus millions if he'd relied on her assessment. Insurance proved to be another immediate concern. Their current renter's policy wouldn't begin to cover vintage aircraft worth millions of dollars, and specialized aviation insurance required documentation and appraisals that would take weeks to arrange. Until proper coverage was in place, the collection represented both an incredible asset and a terrifying liability. The local bank in Cedar Falls had never dealt with collateral of this nature, but the manager was helpful in arranging temporary security measures and recommending specialists who could assist with wealth management on a scale that dwarfed anything the rural institution had previously encountered. Emma spent her afternoon exploring the property with newfound appreciation for their change in circumstances. The 40 acres that had seemed like an overwhelming responsibility now felt like a private estate, complete with historical artifacts and sufficient space for whatever adventures they might choose to pursue. Her excitement was infectious, reminding Marcus that wealth was only meaningful if it enhanced the quality of their life together. That evening, as they sat on the farmhouse's sagging front porch watching the sun set over their new domain, Emma made an observation that crystallized the most important aspect of their transformation. "Daddy, I'm glad we're rich now, but I'm more glad that we found a place where we belong." The comment captured something essential about their journey from urban struggle to rural abundance. The money would solve their immediate problems and create opportunities they'd never imagined, but the real gift was discovering a place where they could build the stable, secure life Emma deserved, surrounded by reminders that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as burdens that nobody else wants to carry. The vintage aircraft sitting in their hangar weren't just financial assets. They were symbols of dreams that had been carefully preserved by someone who believed in the value of maintaining hope, even when circumstances suggested that hope was impractical. Uncle Walter's legacy wasn't just about money. It was about recognizing potential where others saw only problems, about understanding that true wealth sometimes hides behind appearances of worthlessness. As Marcus tucked Emma into bed in the farmhouse that was beginning to feel like home, he realized that their story was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to prove worthy of the extraordinary gift they'd been given. But tonight, they could simply rest in the knowledge that their struggles were over, their security established, their future limited only by their ability to imagine what was possible when fate decided to transform a struggling single father's darkest moment into the brightest chapter of their shared adventure. The phone call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, jarring Marcus from the first peaceful sleep he'd enjoyed since arriving in Cedar Falls. The voice belonged to someone who introduced himself as Detective Ray Morrison from the Iowa State Bureau of Investigation, speaking with the careful neutrality that suggested serious business. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to speak with you about your uncle's aircraft collection. There are some questions that have come to our attention regarding the provenance of certain items in your inheritance." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he processed the implications. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that require an in-person conversation. I'll be at your property within the hour." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone while his mind raced through possibilities that ranged from paperwork irregularities to something far more serious. Emma was still sleeping, and he decided to let her rest while he dealt with whatever crisis was developing around their newfound fortune. Detective Morrison arrived precisely 1 hour later, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Agent Patricia Wells from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Both wore the kind of serious expressions that suggested this wasn't a routine inquiry about inheritance documentation. Their badges and credentials looked authentic, their questions probing and specific. "Your Uncle Walter Sullivan maintained correspondence with several international buyers over the past 5 years. Agent Wells explained as they stood beside the hangar. Some of those buyers are persons of interest in ongoing investigations related to stolen aircraft and forged documentation. Are you saying the planes are stolen? Marcus asked, feeling his newfound security crumbling around him. We're saying there are irregularities that need to be investigated. Detective Morrison replied carefully. Until we can verify the chain of ownership for each aircraft, this collection is considered potential evidence in a federal investigation. The implications hit Marcus like physical blows. If the aircraft were stolen or illegally obtained, he could lose everything while potentially facing criminal charges himself. Emma would witness her father being arrested, their brief taste of financial security would evaporate, and they'd be worse off than before they'd left Chicago. Agent Wells produced a thick folder containing photocopied documents, correspondence, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. Your uncle was in contact with Viktor Kozlov, a Russian national who's been trafficking stolen aircraft through a network of private collectors. Some of the serial numbers in your hangar match aircraft reported missing from museums and private collections across Europe. Marcus examined the documents with growing horror. Uncle Walter's meticulous records, which he'd interpreted as evidence of legitimate collecting, might actually document participation in an international theft ring. The man he'd remembered as an eccentric but harmless relative could have been a sophisticated criminal whose activities were now threatening to destroy the lives of his innocent inheritors. I had no knowledge of any illegal activities, Marcus said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. I inherited this collection 6 weeks ago, and I've been trying to understand what I actually own. We believe you, Detective Morrison said, though his tone remained professionally skeptical. But your cooperation will be essential in resolving these questions. We'll need complete access to the hangar, all documentation, and your full cooperation in our investigation. What does that mean for us? Are we under arrest? Not at this time. But you can't sell, move, or modify anything in that hangar until our investigation is complete. The entire collection is effectively frozen. Emma appeared on the farmhouse porch, rubbing sleep from her eyes and looking confused by the presence of official vehicles in their driveway. Marcus waved to her reassuringly, trying to project calm while his world collapsed around him for the second time in 2 months. How long will the investigation take? He asked. Could be weeks, could be months, Agent Wells replied. International cases are complicated, especially when they involve documentation from multiple countries spanning several decades. After the federal agents departed with promises to return the following day to begin their detailed examination, Marcus sat on the farmhouse steps trying to explain to Emma why strangers would be examining their airplanes and why they couldn't touch anything in the hangar. Are we in trouble, Daddy? She asked with a directness that had become her trademark approach to adult complications. I don't think so, sweetheart. But some of Uncle Walter's airplanes might have been stolen from other people, and the police need to figure out which ones belong to whom. Does that mean we're not rich anymore? The question cut straight to his deepest fears. I don't know yet. We have to wait and see what the investigation discovers. Emma processed this information with characteristic resilience, though Marcus could see disappointment flickering behind her brave acceptance. She'd begun to imagine a future where financial worries were permanently resolved, where her father didn't spend sleepless nights calculating expenses against inadequate income. Now that future was threatened by circumstances neither of them had created or could control. The next few days brought a parade of experts, investigators, and federal agents who treated the hangar like a crime scene. Each aircraft was photographed from multiple angles, serial numbers were verified against international databases, and documentation was examined by specialists in authentication and forgery detection. The methodical process transformed their private space into something resembling a forensic laboratory. Marcus found himself caught between cooperation and growing resentment. He answered questions honestly, provided access to everything the investigators requested, and maintained a helpful attitude while watching strangers dissect Uncle Walter's life's work with clinical detachment. The aircraft that had seemed like treasures just days earlier now felt like evidence in a case that could destroy his family's future. Frank Patterson and Jim Bradley arrived on Thursday morning, drawn by rumors circulating through the local aviation community about federal investigations and suspicious aircraft. Both men looked shaken by developments they'd never anticipated when they'd helped authenticate the collection. This doesn't make sense, Jim insisted as they watched investigators examining the Stearman's engine compartment. I worked with Walter on that restoration personally. We found that airplane in a barn outside Kansas City, bought it from a farmer whose grandfather had stored it there since 1943. Everything was documented, legitimate, above board. The P-51 came from a museum in California that was selling off assets to pay debts, Frank added. Walter showed me the paperwork. The sale was completely legal and proper. Their testimonies provided some reassurance, but Marcus had learned that good intentions and honest mistakes could still result in legal complications that destroyed innocent lives. Even if Uncle Walter had believed he was purchasing legitimate aircraft, subsequent investigation might reveal that earlier transactions in the chain of ownership involved theft or fraud. The financial implications were becoming clear through conversations with lawyers and insurance representatives. Even if the investigation eventually cleared most of the collection, the legal costs and delays could consume whatever assets remained. Specialized aviation attorneys charged fees that reflected the complexity of international aircraft law. And defending against federal allegations required expertise that didn't come cheaply. Emma's school situation added another layer of stress to their deteriorating circumstances. The Cedar Falls Elementary School principal, Mrs. Henderson, had been enthusiastic about enrolling a new student mid-semester, especially one whose family brought such interesting local news. But federal investigations and potential criminal associations weren't the kind of publicity that rural school districts welcomed. There have been some concerns raised by parents, Mrs. Henderson explained during a phone call that Marcus had been dreading. Questions about whether it's appropriate for Emma to continue attending school here while these legal matters are unresolved. "She's 8 years old," Marcus replied, struggling to control his anger. "She has nothing to do with any aircraft investigations." "I understand that, Mr. Sullivan, and personally I believe Emma should continue her education without interruption. But the school board meets next week, and I can't guarantee they'll see the situation the same way." The possibility of Emma being excluded from school because of circumstances beyond her control represented a new low in their rapidly deteriorating situation. She'd already endured enough disruption in her young life without becoming a victim of adult paranoia and legal complications she couldn't possibly understand. That evening, as they sat in the farmhouse kitchen eating a dinner of canned soup and generic crackers, Emma made an observation that broke Marcus's heart with its simple accuracy. "The other kids at school are saying we're criminals because we have stolen airplanes. Mrs. Peterson told them to stop talking about it, but they still whisper when they think I can't hear them." Marcus felt rage building toward the adults who'd created an atmosphere where his innocent daughter faced social ostracism because of legal complications she hadn't caused. But anger wouldn't solve their problems, and Emma needed reassurance rather than witnessing her father's frustration with circumstances beyond their control. "Some people don't understand the difference between being accused of something and actually doing something wrong," he explained carefully. "The investigators are trying to figure out if Uncle Walter accidentally bought airplanes that had been stolen from other people. That doesn't make us criminals, it just means we inherited a complicated situation. Will we have to give back all the airplanes? Maybe some of them. We'll have to wait and see what the investigation discovers." What will happen to us then? The question he'd been avoiding finally demanded an honest answer. If the entire collection was confiscated as stolen property, they'd be left with 40 acres of farmland and buildings that would be difficult to sell because of their association with a federal investigation. His savings were nearly exhausted, job prospects in rural Iowa were limited, and returning to Chicago would mean admitting failure while facing the same financial pressures that had driven them away. "We'll figure something out, sweetheart. We always do." Emma nodded with a stoic acceptance she'd learned through years of adapting to circumstances that adults created but children had to endure. Her resilience amazed Marcus daily, but it also reminded him of how much upheaval she'd already experienced in her short life. The weekend brought unexpected visitors who would complicate their situation in ways Marcus couldn't have anticipated. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into their gravel driveway on Saturday morning, followed by a second vehicle that screamed expensive private security. The men who emerged wore business suits that cost more than Marcus's monthly salary and carried themselves with the confidence that comes from unlimited resources. The leader introduced himself as Arthur Blackwood, representing what he described as interested parties, who had been following the federal investigation with considerable attention. His accent suggested expensive private education, his manner conveyed authority that wasn't dependent on official credentials, and his presence felt vaguely threatening, despite his polite demeanor. "Mr. Sullivan, I represent collectors who have substantial investments in the vintage aircraft market. Recent developments regarding your uncle's collection have created certain complications that affect our clients' interests. What kind of complications? Marcus asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. If certain aircraft in your hangar are determined to be stolen property, they'll need to be returned to their rightful owners. My clients are prepared to facilitate that process in ways that could benefit everyone involved. The conversation felt like negotiation with criminals, though Blackwood maintained the vocabulary and demeanor of legitimate business. Marcus found himself wondering whether Uncle Walter had been involved with people who operated outside legal boundaries, using the vintage aircraft market as cover for activities that had nothing to do with historical preservation. "I'm cooperating fully with the federal investigation," Marcus said carefully. "Any decisions about the aircraft will be made through proper legal channels." Of course, Blackwood agreed smoothly, but legal channels can be slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Private arrangements often achieve better outcomes for everyone concerned. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. These people had resources and connections that could either help or harm his family's situation, depending on his willingness to cooperate with arrangements that might not be entirely legal themselves. Emma had been watching from the farmhouse window, and Marcus could see her confusion about why more strangers were visiting to discuss their airplanes. The investigation had already disrupted her school life and social relationships. Now it was bringing potentially dangerous people to their doorstep. "I need time to consider your offer," Marcus said, hoping to end the conversation without committing to anything that might make their legal situation worse. "Time is a luxury you may not be able to afford," Blackwood replied. "But I'll be in touch soon to discuss this further." After the visitors departed, Marcus called the federal agents to report the contact, unsure whether Blackwood represented another layer of criminal activity or legitimate collectors trying to protect their investments. Agent Wells listened to his account with interest that suggested this development wasn't entirely unexpected. "Mr. Blackwood and his associates have appeared in several of our investigations," she explained. "They operate in gray areas of international commerce that aren't technically illegal but often involve morally questionable practices. Should I be worried about my family's safety? Take reasonable precautions, but don't panic. These people prefer negotiation to violence, and your cooperation with our investigation provides some protection." The advice wasn't particularly reassuring. Marcus had moved to rural Iowa seeking security and stability for Emma, not involvement in international aircraft trafficking that attracted federal investigators and mysterious collectors who made veiled threats about cooperation and arrangements. Sunday morning brought a different kind of visitor, one whose arrival would shift the dynamics of their situation in unexpected directions. Dr. Sarah Chen introduced herself as a professor of aviation history at Iowa State University, specializing in World War II aircraft preservation and authentication. Her credentials were impeccable, her manner professional but warm, and her interest in Uncle Walter's collection was purely academic. "I've been following the federal investigation through contacts in the aviation community," she explained as they walked toward the hangar. "Some of the aircraft described in news reports are historically significant beyond their monetary value." Dr. Chen's examination of the collection revealed expertise that impressed even the federal investigators. She could identify specific variants of aircraft models, explain the historical significance of particular paint schemes, and provide context that transformed mechanical artifacts into windows into American aviation history. "This P-51 Mustang isn't just any fighter plane," she explained, running her hands along the aircraft's polished fuselage. "The serial number indicates it was one of only 12 aircraft modified for a specific mission over Germany in 1944. If the documentation is authentic, this particular plane participated in operations that helped turn the tide of the war." Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Marcus that regardless of legal complications, they were surrounded by genuine historical treasures that connected past achievements to present opportunities in ways that transcended financial considerations. "Even if some aircraft prove to be stolen property," Dr. Chen continued, "others might be cleared for legitimate ownership. The key is proper authentication and documentation of their provenance through legitimate channels." Emma had joined their conversation, drawn by Dr. Chen's obvious expertise and genuine enthusiasm for the aircraft collection. Unlike the investigators and mysterious collectors who'd been treating the hangar like a crime scene or business opportunity, Dr. Chen saw the planes as historical artifacts worthy of preservation and study. "Could I learn about airplane history?" Emma asked, with characteristic directness. "Absolutely," Dr. Chen replied. Aviation history is filled with stories about brave people who pushed the boundaries of what was possible, just like you and your father are doing now. The comparison between historical aviation pioneers and their current circumstances struck Marcus as particularly apt. They were, indeed, pushing boundaries, navigating uncharted territory where inheritance law intersected with international aircraft trafficking in ways that nobody had prepared them to handle. Dr. Chen's involvement would prove crucial in the weeks that followed. Her academic credentials provided credibility with federal investigators. Her expertise helped distinguish between legitimate and questionable aircraft in the collection, and her connections with museums and historical societies offered alternatives to the stark choice between criminal prosecution and surrender of all assets. "There's another option you should consider," she said as their first meeting concluded. "If some aircraft are cleared by the investigation, donating them to appropriate museums could provide significant tax benefits while ensuring their historical preservation. You'd maintain ownership while placing them in institutions that could properly display and maintain them." The suggestion offered a middle path between complete financial loss and the complexities of managing a private collection that had attracted unwanted attention from both law enforcement and criminal elements. Museums would provide security, expertise, and public access while relieving Marcus of the burden of maintaining historically significant aircraft he was unqualified to preserve properly. That evening, as Marcus tucked Emma into bed in the farmhouse that was beginning to feel less like home and more like a temporary refuge, she asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Daddy, are we going to have to leave here too?" The uncertainty in her voice broke his heart. Emma had already endured enough upheaval in her young life, and now circumstances beyond their control were threatening to uproot them again, just as they'd begun to establish new routines and relationships. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but whatever happens, we'll face it together." "I like it here," she said, quietly. "Even with all the airplane problems, I like having space to run around and seeing the stars at night." Her simple preference for their rural refuge over urban uncertainty reminded Marcus that wealth wasn't the only measure of life quality. Even if the aircraft investigation resulted in financial loss, they still had 40 acres of farmland, a house that needed work but provided shelter, and a community that had begun to accept them despite the legal complications surrounding their inheritance. The federal investigation had transformed their situation from a miracle inheritance into a complex legal nightmare. But it hadn't changed the fundamental choice they'd made to build a life together in a place where Emma could grow up with security and stability. Whatever assets remained after the legal process concluded, they would use them to create the kind of future that measured success in terms of happiness, rather than merely financial accumulation. Outside their windows, the Iowa farmland stretched toward horizons that seemed infinite under starlight that city living had never allowed them to appreciate. The vintage aircraft sitting in their hangar might represent stolen property or legitimate treasures, but the land beneath their feet was unquestionably theirs, offering possibilities that didn't depend on the outcome of federal investigations or the schemes of international collectors. Monday morning would bring new developments in their ongoing legal drama, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together in a place where Emma could learn about aviation history from a professor who saw educational opportunity rather than criminal evidence, where neighbors like Frank and Jim offered friendship rather than judgment, and where the vast Iowa sky reminded them daily that some things were too large and beautiful to be diminished by human complications. The phone call from Agent Wells came just after dawn on Monday, carrying news that would reshape everything they thought they understood about their situation. Her voice carried an excitement that hadn't been present during previous conversations, suggesting developments that favored their interests rather than threatening them. "Mr. Sullivan, our investigation has taken an unexpected turn. We need to meet immediately to discuss new information that significantly affects your case." Within an hour, Agent Wells and Detective Morrison were sitting in their farmhouse kitchen, surrounded by documents that painted a very different picture of Uncle Walter's activities than anyone had previously suspected. The correspondence and financial records that had initially suggested criminal associations actually documented an elaborate undercover operation that had been years in the making. "Your uncle wasn't trafficking stolen aircraft," Agent Wells explained, spreading photocopied documents across their kitchen table. "He was working with us to identify and recover stolen aircraft from an international network of thieves and forgers." The revelation hit Marcus like lightning, transforming Uncle Walter from suspected criminal into federal informant whose apparent illegal activities had been carefully orchestrated to expose actual criminals. The mysterious correspondence with Viktor Kozlov hadn't documented participation in theft. It had provided evidence that would eventually destroy an international aircraft trafficking network. Walter's collection served as bait. Detective Morrison continued. Criminals were drawn to what appeared to be a sophisticated collector willing to purchase aircraft without asking difficult questions about provenance. Once they made contact, Walter documented their operations and provided evidence that we've been using to build cases against major players in international aircraft theft. Emma had been listening with the intense concentration she applied to adult conversations that affected their lives. So Uncle Walters was like a secret agent. Something like that, Agent Wells agreed with a smile. He was helping us catch real criminals by pretending to be a criminal himself. The implications were staggering. Not only were they cleared of any criminal associations, but Uncle Walter's collection was entirely legitimate, purchased through proper channels, and maintained as cover for his cooperation with federal law enforcement. The aircraft that had seemed too valuable to be real were actually authenticated historical treasures that belonged to them without legal complications. There's more, Detective Morrison added. Walter's cooperation was so valuable that he was entitled to substantial compensation from asset forfeiture proceedings. That money was held in trust, awaiting resolution of his undercover work. Since he died before the operation concluded, that compensation becomes part of his estate. Marcus felt dizzy as he processed the information. Not only did they legitimately own aircraft worth millions of dollars, but Uncle Walter had earned additional millions through his cooperation with federal law enforcement. Their inheritance wasn't just legitimate, it was larger than they'd ever imagined. How much additional compensation are we talking about? Marcus asked. Agent Wells consulted her documentation. Approximately $4.7 million, held in federal accounts that will be transferred to his estate once the paperwork is processed. The morning that had begun with anxiety about criminal prosecution had transformed into financial security beyond anything Marcus had dared imagine. Emma would never have to worry about money, could attend any school she chose, pursue any interests that captured her imagination, and grow up with opportunities that most children could only dream about. But the most important revelation wasn't financial. Uncle Walter hadn't been an eccentric collector whose judgment might have been compromised by enthusiasm for vintage aircraft. He'd been a patriotic citizen who'd risked his reputation and safety to help law enforcement capture criminals who were stealing irreplaceable pieces of aviation history. His legacy wasn't just about preserving aircraft. It was about preserving justice and protecting cultural treasures for future generations. The news spread through Cedar Falls with the speed that characterizes small communities where everyone's business becomes common knowledge. The whispers about criminal associations were replaced by pride in their local hero who'd worked undercover to catch international thieves. Emma's classmates, who'd been treating her like a pariah, suddenly wanted to hear stories about her secret agent great-uncle and his collection of spy planes. Mrs. Henderson called that afternoon to apologize for the school board's concerns and to invite Emma to give a presentation about aviation history to her classmates. The same parents who'd questioned her presence in their children's school now wanted their kids to learn from the girl whose family had inherited a legitimate piece of American aviation heritage. Frank Patterson and Jim Bradley returned that evening with cases of beer and expressions of vindication. They'd never doubted Uncle Walter's integrity, but federal investigations had created uncertainty that made everyone question their assumptions about a man they'd considered a friend and colleague. Walter always said those birds were worth more than money, Jim reflected as they sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sun set over their transformed circumstances. Turns out he was right in ways we never understood. Dr. Chen arrived the following day with representatives from 3 different aviation museums, all eager to discuss partnerships that would allow public display of Uncle Walter's collection while maintaining Marcus's ownership. The aircraft weren't just valuable assets. They were historically significant artifacts that deserved to be seen and appreciated by aviation enthusiasts and history students across the country. We could arrange rotating displays, Dr. Chen explained. Some aircraft would be permanently housed at the Smithsonian, others would tour regional museums, and a few could remain here as the centerpiece of a private aviation museum that would honor your uncle's memory while educating the public. The suggestion offered a perfect solution to the practical challenges of managing a multi-million-dollar aircraft collection in rural Iowa. Professional museums would provide security, maintenance, and expertise while allowing Marcus and Emma to remain connected to Uncle Walter's legacy without being overwhelmed by its management requirements. Emma had been quiet during the discussions about museum partnerships, but finally spoke up with a question that cut straight to the heart of their situation. If we put the airplanes in museums, will people learn about Uncle Walter and how he helped catch the bad guys? Dr. Chen's face lit up with enthusiasm. Absolutely. Walter's story is an important part of aviation history now. His courage in working undercover to protect these aircraft from theft deserves to be remembered and celebrated. That evening, as Marcus and Emma walked through the hangar that had transformed from burden to blessing to crime scene to treasure trove in the span of just weeks, they discussed plans for a future that neither of them could have imagined when they'd driven away from Chicago in a rental truck loaded with their meager possessions. The aircraft surrounding them represented more than financial security. They symbolized the unexpected ways that life could reward people who maintained their integrity under pressure, who cooperated with authorities even when cooperation seemed risky, and who preserved important things for future generations, even when the value of those things wasn't immediately apparent. Uncle Walter's legacy wasn't just about money or historical artifacts. It was about the principle that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous, eventually led to outcomes that benefited everyone involved. His willingness to work undercover for years, risking his reputation and safety to help capture criminals, had preserved irreplaceable pieces of aviation history while providing his nephew's family with resources that would last for generations. The hangar that had once seemed like a burden filled with worthless junk now stood as a testament to the power of hidden value, careful preservation, and the courage to sacrifice personal comfort for principles that transcended individual benefit. Marcus and Emma had inherited more than aircraft and money. They'd inherited a legacy of service, courage, and commitment to preserving important things for future generations, who would benefit from past sacrifices they might never fully understand or appreciate. As they locked the hangar and walked back toward the farmhouse under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than any they'd seen from their city apartment, Emma slipped her hand into Marcus's and squeezed gently. "I'm proud that Uncle Walter was our family, Daddy. Even if I never got to meet him, I'm proud to be related to someone who helped catch bad guys and saved beautiful airplanes." Marcus squeezed back, understanding that their story had evolved far beyond financial transformation into something more meaningful and lasting. They'd discovered that true wealth wasn't just about having enough money to solve immediate problems, but about being connected to purposes larger than personal comfort, about contributing to efforts that preserved important things for people they would never meet, about being part of legacies that improved the world in ways that extended far beyond individual benefit. The Iowa farmland stretched around them toward horizons that now seemed filled with possibilities rather than limitations. Tomorrow would bring decisions about museum partnerships, financial management, and educational opportunities that wealth made possible. But tonight they could simply rest in the knowledge that they'd inherited not just assets but values worth preserving, and principles worth sharing with others who needed reminders that integrity, courage, and patience were qualities that eventually created opportunities for service that transcended personal benefit. The weathered farmhouse that had seemed like exile just weeks earlier now felt like the foundation for adventures they were only beginning to imagine. 6 months later, Marcus stood before a crowd of 300 people gathered on the Cedar Falls Municipal Airport tarmac, watching as the fully restored P-51 Mustang taxied into position for its first public flight demonstration since Uncle Walter's passing. The aircraft gleamed in the morning sunlight, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the faces of aviation enthusiasts, local families, and media representatives who had traveled from across the Midwest to witness the inaugural event of the Marcus Sullivan Aviation Heritage Foundation. Emma sat in the front row of folding chairs arranged for VIP guests, wearing a navy blue dress with a vintage aviation pin that had belonged to her great-uncle. At 9 years old, she had become the foundation's youngest board member and most enthusiastic ambassador, speaking to school groups about aviation history with the confidence of someone who had inherited both wealth and purpose in equal measure. Her transformation from a shy girl worried about changing schools to a poised young advocate for historical preservation exemplified everything the foundation hoped to achieve. The pilot climbing into the Mustang's cockpit was Colonel Patricia Hawk Morrison, a retired Air Force test pilot who had volunteered her services when she learned about Uncle Walter's undercover work and his dedication to preserving aviation history. Her presence added credibility to the Foundation's mission, while providing the expertise necessary to safely operate multi-million-dollar historical aircraft for educational purposes. Dr. Sarah Chen stood beside the microphone, preparing to address the crowd about the significance of the day's demonstration. Her academic partnership with the Foundation had evolved into something much larger, encompassing a comprehensive educational program that brought aviation history directly to students across Iowa and neighboring states. The success of their collaboration had attracted attention from the Department of Education, which was considering funding similar programs in other regions where historical aircraft collections could serve educational purposes. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and nervousness as he watched the pre-flight preparations. The Foundation represented Uncle Walter's true legacy, transforming his undercover work and aircraft collection into a lasting contribution to education and historical preservation. But the public nature of their mission meant accepting scrutiny and responsibility that extended far beyond their family's immediate interests. The crowd included faces that had become familiar over the past months. Frank Patterson and Jim Bradley occupied front-row seats, their expertise having proven invaluable in maintaining the aircraft and training volunteer mechanics who helped keep the collection in flying condition. Mayor Jennifer Walsh sat nearby, her initial skepticism about the Foundation's impact on Cedar Falls having evolved into enthusiastic support, as tourism and educational partnerships brought new economic opportunities to their rural community. Arthur Blackwood was notably absent from the gathering, his mysterious organization having withdrawn their interest once Uncle Walter's legitimate status and federal cooperation became public knowledge. The aircraft trafficking network he had represented was currently the subject of international prosecutions that would likely continue for years, removing threats that had briefly shadowed Marcus and Emma's newfound security. Agent Wells occupied a seat in the middle section, her presence serving as both protection and symbol of the ongoing partnership between the Foundation and federal law enforcement. The relationship had evolved beyond Uncle Walter's undercover work into active cooperation in educating young people about the importance of protecting cultural heritage from criminal exploitation. As Colonel Morrison completed her pre-flight checks and the Mustang's engine roared to life, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The struggling single father who had inherited what everyone dismissed as worthless junk had become the director of a foundation managing assets worth over $20 million, including the federal compensation that had finally been transferred to Uncle Walter's estate. But the true measure of their transformation wasn't financial. Emma's confidence and enthusiasm for learning represented the kind of success that couldn't be quantified in monetary terms. Her ability to speak knowledgeably about aviation history, her comfort in addressing adult audiences, and her genuine excitement about sharing Uncle Walter's story with other children demonstrated that wealth had enhanced, rather than corrupted, her natural curiosity and compassion. The Foundation's educational programs had reached over 5,000 students in their first year of operation, bringing aviation history directly to classrooms where traditional field trips to distant museums weren't financially feasible. Mobile displays featuring aircraft engines, historical artifacts, and interactive exhibits allowed children to experience the reality of aviation innovation in ways that textbooks couldn't provide. Dr. Chen's voice carried clearly across the tarmac as she explained the historical significance of the P-51 Mustang to the assembled crowd. Her presentation wove together technical specifications, wartime service records, and Uncle Walter's restoration efforts into a narrative that honored both the aircraft's original purpose and its contemporary educational mission. This particular Mustang represents more than mechanical achievement, she explained, gesturing toward the aircraft as Colonel Morrison completed her final preparations. It embodies the innovative spirit that has always driven American aviation, the courage of pilots who risked everything for principles larger than personal comfort, and the dedication of people like Marcus Sullivan who preserved these machines for future generations to study and appreciate. Emma had been chosen to give the signal for takeoff, an honor that reflected her unique position as both Foundation board member and symbol of the educational mission Uncle Walter's legacy had made possible. She approached the microphone with poise that would have been unimaginable just months earlier, when she had been a shy child worried about fitting into yet another new school. Uncle Walter always said that airplanes were like dreams with wings, she began, her young voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. Today we're sharing his dream with everyone who believes that learning about the past helps us build a better future. Colonel Morrison, the Walter Sullivan Aviation Heritage Foundation, is proud to clear you for takeoff. The Mustang responded to Colonel Morrison's expert touch with graceful power, accelerating down the runway before lifting into the Iowa sky with the same authority it had demonstrated over European battlefields 7 decades earlier. The crowd erupted in applause as the restored fighter climbed toward the clouds, its engine note carrying echoes of history that connected past achievements to present possibilities. Marcus found himself thinking about Uncle Walter's sacrifice and courage as he watched the aircraft perform aerobatic maneuvers that showcased both its original capabilities and the quality of its restoration. Working undercover for years, risking his reputation and safety to help federal agents capture criminals, maintaining elaborate deceptions while preserving genuine historical treasures had required dedication that few people would have been willing to sustain. The Foundation's success had attracted partnership offers from institutions that Marcus was still learning to evaluate. The Smithsonian Institution wanted to establish a permanent Walter Sullivan exhibit featuring 3 of the aircraft, along with documentation of his undercover work. The Air Force Academy had proposed an educational exchange program that would bring cadets to Cedar Falls for hands-on experience with vintage aircraft maintenance and operation. Corporate sponsors were beginning to express interest in supporting the Foundation's educational mission, recognizing the public relations value of association with aviation heritage and youth education. But Marcus remained cautious about partnerships that might compromise the Foundation's independence or transform Uncle Walter's legacy into marketing opportunities that served corporate interests more than educational purposes. As the demonstration flight continued overhead, Emma took her seat beside Marcus and leaned against his shoulder with the comfortable affection that had always characterized their relationship. Wealth had provided security and opportunities, but it hadn't changed the fundamental bond between father and daughter that had sustained them through years of struggle and uncertainty. "Daddy, do you think Uncle Walter would be proud of what we're doing with his airplanes?" she asked, her question reflecting the sense of responsibility that had grown alongside her confidence over the past months. "I think he'd be amazed that his work led to something this wonderful," Marcus replied honestly. "But I also think he'd be most proud that you're using your opportunities to help other children learn and grow." The Foundation's impact extended beyond aviation education into broader lessons about perseverance, integrity, and the value of preserving important things for future generations. Students who visited their programs learned about Uncle Walter's courage in working undercover to protect cultural heritage, about the innovation and sacrifice that had produced the aircraft they were studying, and about the importance of maintaining historical knowledge in an age when technological advancements sometimes overshadowed appreciation for past achievements. Colonel Morrison brought the Mustang in for a perfect landing, the aircraft touching down with the smooth precision that demonstrated both pilot skill and mechanical excellence. As she taxied back toward the gathered crowd, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction that transcended financial success or public recognition. They had transformed Uncle Walter's secret sacrifice into public education, his hidden courage into visible inspiration for young people who needed reminders that ordinary individuals could accomplish extraordinary things when they committed themselves to purposes larger than personal benefit. The afternoon brought tours of the expanded hangar facility, now equipped with classroom space, interactive displays, and maintenance areas where visitors could observe ongoing restoration work on additional aircraft the Foundation had acquired through donations and purchases. The original 7 aircraft that had constituted Uncle Walter's collection now anchored a growing fleet that included planes donated by families who wanted their own aviation heritage preserved and shared with future generations. Emma served as a tour guide for groups of children, explaining the function of various aircraft components with enthusiasm that made complex mechanical concepts accessible to young minds. Her ability to connect with other children while demonstrating genuine knowledge had made her the Foundation's most effective ambassador, proof that aviation education could inspire students regardless of their background or previous exposure to mechanical subjects. Dr. Chen had documented the Foundation's educational impact through formal research that was attracting attention from academic institutions across the country. Student test scores in mathematics and science showed measurable improvement following participation in the Foundation's programs, while surveys indicated increased interest in pursuing aviation-related careers among participants. The data provided evidence that hands-on interaction with historical technology enhanced learning in ways that traditional classroom instruction couldn't replicate. Frank Patterson had been hired as the Foundation's chief mechanic, his decades of experience invaluable in maintaining aircraft that were flown regularly for educational demonstrations rather than preserved as static displays. His workshop had become a training center where high school students could learn aircraft maintenance skills while contributing to the preservation of aviation history. Jim Bradley served as the Foundation's historian, documenting not only Uncle Walter's story but the broader history of aviation in Iowa and the Midwest. His research had uncovered dozens of stories about local pilots, aircraft manufacturers, and aviation pioneers whose contributions had been forgotten or overlooked by traditional historical accounts. The Foundation's archive was becoming a repository for regional aviation heritage that complemented its collection of restored aircraft. The evening celebration took place in the newly constructed education center adjacent to the original hangar, a facility designed to accommodate groups of up to 200 students for lectures, demonstrations, and hands-on learning activities. The building's design incorporated elements that honored Uncle Walter's memory while providing modern amenities necessary for effective educational programming. Marcus addressed the gathering of donors, volunteers, educators, and community members who had supported the Foundation's development over the past months. His remarks focused on Uncle Walter's vision and sacrifice rather than the family's financial transformation, emphasizing the educational mission that gave meaning to their inherited wealth. Walter Sullivan spent years protecting these aircraft from criminals who saw them only as valuable commodities to be bought and sold, Marcus explained to the assembled crowd. He understood that their true worth lay not in their monetary value, but in their power to inspire future generations to pursue innovation, to appreciate the courage of those who came before us, and to understand that preserving history is essential to building a better future. The Foundation's board of directors had grown to include aviation experts, educators, and community leaders who provided guidance on policy decisions and strategic planning. Their diverse expertise ensured that educational programming maintained high standards while remaining accessible to students from various backgrounds and economic circumstances. Emma's speech to the gathered supporters demonstrated the confidence and purpose that had emerged from their transformed circumstances. Her remarks focused on the responsibility that came with inheriting both wealth and historical artifacts, emphasizing the Foundation's commitment to ensuring that Uncle Walter's sacrifice continued to benefit others long after his death. Uncle Walter worked in secret to protect these airplanes from people who wanted to steal them. She told the audience with poise that impressed the adults listening to her presentation. Now we get to work in public to share them with everyone who wants to learn about aviation history and the brave people who made flying possible. The applause that followed her speech reflected genuine appreciation for her maturity and dedication, rather than mere politeness toward a wealthy donor's daughter. Emma had earned respect through her knowledge, enthusiasm, and ability to articulate the Foundation's mission in terms that resonated with audiences ranging from elementary school students to aviation professionals. Dr. Chen announced plans for expanding the Foundation's reach through partnerships with schools in neighboring states, satellite programs that would bring aviation education to communities without access to historical aircraft collections, and summer camps that would provide intensive learning experiences for students with particular interest in aviation careers. The federal compensation that had been transferred to Uncle Walter's estate provided financial resources sufficient to sustain the Foundation's operations indefinitely, but Marcus remained committed to developing additional revenue streams through corporate partnerships, educational contracts, and carefully managed commercial activities that supported rather than compromised their educational mission. Corporate sponsors were beginning to recognize the value of associating their brands with aviation heritage and youth education, offering funding in exchange for tasteful recognition at Foundation events and in educational materials. But Marcus insisted on maintaining strict standards regarding partnerships that preserve the Foundation's independence and credibility. Agent Wells concluded the evening's presentations with remarks about Uncle Walter's contribution to federal law enforcement and the ongoing prosecutions that his undercover work had made possible. Her presence served as a reminder that the Foundation's educational mission was connected to larger efforts to protect cultural heritage from criminal exploitation. Walter Sullivan's courage in working undercover for years to help us identify and prosecute aircraft thieves has led to the recovery of over 40 stolen aircraft worth more than $60 million, she announced to the impressed gathering. But his greatest legacy may be the educational programs that are inspiring young people to pursue careers in aviation and to understand the importance of preserving historical artifacts for future generations. As the celebration concluded and guests departed into the clear Iowa evening, Marcus and Emma walked through the hangar one final time, surrounded by aircraft that had been transformed from hidden treasures into public resources. The P-51 Mustang sat in its designated position, its polished surface reflecting the hangar's lighting while seeming to wait patiently for its next opportunity to carry Uncle Walter's story into the sky. The foundation represented more than successful wealth management or effective public relations. It embodied the principle that true inheritance involved not just receiving valuable assets, but accepting responsibility for using those assets in ways that honored their source while benefiting others who had contributed nothing to their acquisition but deserved opportunities to learn and grow. Emma's transformation from a struggling student worried about frequent school changes to a confident young advocate for aviation education exemplified the foundation's broader impact. She had discovered that wealth created obligations as well as opportunities, that privilege required service rather than merely comfort, and that the greatest satisfaction came from sharing rather than hoarding the advantages that inheritance had provided. Marcus felt deep gratitude for Uncle Walter's sacrifice and the federal agents who had protected his family during the investigation that had initially threatened to destroy everything they thought they had gained. The courage required to work undercover for years, maintaining elaborate deceptions while preserving genuine historical treasures, had created opportunities that extended far beyond their family's immediate benefit. The Cedar Falls community had embraced the Foundation's presence with enthusiasm that reflected both pride in their association with aviation history and appreciation for the economic benefits that educational tourism brought to their rural economy. Hotels, restaurants, and local businesses were experiencing increased activity from visitors who came to participate in Foundation programs or attend special events featuring the restored aircraft. As they locked the hangar and walked toward the farmhouse that had been extensively renovated but retained its essential character, Emma made an observation that captured the essence of their transformed circumstances. "Daddy, I think the best part about being rich isn't having lots of money. It's being able to help other kids learn about interesting things and knowing that Uncle Walter's sacrifice meant something important." Her comment reflected wisdom that many adults never acquired, understanding that wealth without purpose was merely accumulation, that privilege without service was ultimately meaningless, and that the greatest satisfaction came from using advantages to create opportunities for others, rather than simply enhancing personal comfort. The Iowa sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with stars that seemed brighter than any they had seen from their cramped city apartment. The Foundation's aircraft might return to the sky tomorrow for another educational demonstration, but tonight they rested in the security of proper preservation, maintained by people who understood their historical significance and committed to sharing their stories with future generations who would benefit from past sacrifices they might never fully comprehend. Marcus and Emma had inherited more than aircraft and money. They had received a legacy of service, courage, and commitment to preserving important things for people they would never meet. Uncle Walter's undercover work had protected irreplaceable pieces of aviation history while providing his family with resources and purpose that would last for generations. The struggling single father who had arrived in Cedar Falls expecting to inherit worthless junk had become the director of a foundation that was reshaping aviation education across the Midwest. But the true measure of their success wasn't financial or professional. It was the knowledge that they were using their inheritance to honor Uncle Walter's memory, while creating opportunities for thousands of young people to discover the excitement of aviation history and the importance of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. Sometimes the greatest treasures really were hidden in plain sight, disguised as burdens that nobody wanted to carry. Sometimes a man's lowest moment really did become the doorway to his greatest triumph. And sometimes the most powerful transformations happened when people discovered that true wealth meant having the resources and courage to serve purposes larger than personal comfort, to preserve important things for future generations, and to ensure that past sacrifices continued to benefit others long after the original heroes were gone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.